Ho ho ho, it's that time of year. No, not Christmas, it's the 6v6 test, and this is going to be a banger, something that Overwatch has been hyping up for quite a long time. I've already done extensive testing on 6v6 and the real differences between 5v5 and 6v6. You can check that video, link in the comments. However, if you want to know what you need to know actually going into this test, some adjustments you need to know generally, and for each specific role, well, that's what we're going to go for. First things first, what the developers are going to be keeping an eye on, I believe they're going to be keeping a careful eye on sustain in this meta. Obviously, in previous 6v6 metas prior to many of the reworks to characters like Orisa and so on, we've had metas where sustain was king and in a really bad way, whether it was double shield goats and so on. Obviously this is going to be 2-2-2 role lock, so it will be less of an issue, and because Orisa doesn't have a shield, shouldn't be much of a problem, but I do expect the developers will keep a careful eye on sustain stack. In my testing of 6v6, I didn't find this to be as much of a problem, so I don't have any real fears in this regard, but I think the developers will be keeping an eye on this. In addition to that, there will be some adjustments to tanks going into the 6v6 test, not just the health pools and the removal of tank passives, minus the ult charge passive. The second thing to keep an eye on is we know there's going to be a lot of adjustments to tank cooldowns, likely lengthening the length of some cooldowns to avoid the sustain stack of having multiple tank cooldowns layering on top of each other. Now, I'm not so sure if I would go this route if I were to balance this mode. I think you'd want to keep the cooldowns relatively shorter, but maybe just not quite as potent. But I understand why they're doing this, why they're sensitive to this. I do know that they're keeping some of the things like Reinhardt's pin control, Winston's alternate fire. Those things will stay in the game, but just keep a careful eye on checking the patch notes when they do go live, and then also checking things and toying around with things in the spawn room before you actually go out, because there will be some adjustments to your tanks when you do play at 6v6. Now, in terms of the actual strategies things that you need to know about, it's going to be different within the 6v6 game mode. Staggering is going to be worse, even with wave respawn. There's just more people to mess things up. I learned this when we were doing our 6v6 pugs, and I really learned that even in a more coordinated environment, it's really easy for people to stagger out just because, like I said, there's more of them. So it's easier to abuse enemy staggers and easier to get staggered yourself. So really be careful of that. And in addition to that, be very experimental and creative. And honestly decisive with breaking chokes. Even though double shields and double stack sustain is weaker now than it was in Overwatch 1, breaking chokes can still be difficult, even without 2 CP. It's up to you as a DPS, tank support, etc., to try to be creative, decisive, deliberate, and honestly even be willing to trade on attack to be able to break defenders' advantage chokes. 6v6 is just a little bit more congested. It is easier to poke out tanks now though, so there's a lot of responsibility to be able to clear out the enemy tanks so you're able to get out of the choke. I highly recommend taking whatever flank routes are available and trying to synchronize pressure as a team. Now for tanks, a couple of meta things here to know. Obviously pairing characters like D.Va, Zarya, and to a lesser extent Sigma with other initiator tanks can be pretty useful. D.Va and Zarya directly enable their tank to go on, the real definition of an off tank with Matrix and Bubble. And Sigma can kind of control an off angle while your main tank is applying pressure on main, which is nice. But one good thing to know is that if you don't always have a D.Va, Zarya, or Sigma, you're going to be just fine. Because I believe, in my experience with testing in 6v6, the double initiator is actually still pretty good. And by double initiator, I mean Winston Ryan, Doomfist Wrecking Ball, probably something like a Hazard Orisa even, right? Double initiator is basically tanks that have the ability to apply presence, apply pressure directly and selfishly without necessarily supporting other people. And if you're running double quote-unquote main tank, double initiator tank, you're going to be just fine in 6v6, even if it's not necessarily as optimal. Obviously, we haven't tested these things as much, but in my experience, having a double initiator tank is still good enough, even if it's not as good as having an initiator and a supporting tank. Now, one thing that is bad is having double off tank. In other words, D.Va Zarya, D.Va Sigma, not going to be great. That also applies a little bit to Roadhog as well, because while he is more initiator in Overwatch 2, he still has many of the same problems he had in Overwatch 1. So if you are going to run double off tank and not have an initiator on the field, you're going to have a hard time. The second point here is talking about tempo or timing. It becomes a lot more important with fewer resources. If you're having a double bubble engage, like let's say you bubble your Winston as a Zarya and you go in off of that engage, it's really important that you actually synchronize around that pressure. One of the things we learned in 6v6 is that if you're able to synchronize your tank's cooldowns, your tank's pressure at the same time, there's a huge reward for that. The team play ceiling is really high from the tank trade side of things. And so it's really important for your entire team to be able to capitalize and pressure. Even if you don't have that synergistic of a cooldown combo, you still need to be really tempoing and timing that pressure at the same time. Doesn't mean you go fast, doesn't mean you go slow, it just means you're synchronized. In 5v5, there's a little bit more leeway for the tanks if they mess up. They don't immediately die. They can take a bad resource trade, live, disengage, and reset. You still might lose the fight, but at least you won't die. In 6v6, you're gonna die if you make a mistake. So it's really important that you synchronize that pressure at the same time as a tank, and then as a DPS and support, you're actually really paying attention to those timing windows, because if you miss that timing window, you probably missed your opportunity to pressure. Both 5v5 and 6v6 have an emphasis on tempo, but 6v6, that window is just a little bit tighter. And finally, in terms of taking space, in 5v5 there's often open lanes that you can use to flank, take angles, and harass backline and DPS directly, especially as a dive tank. But in 6v6 you're more likely to have to take initial tank trades to take space, because more lanes are going to be congested and contested by enemy tank trades. Winston is going to often have to take tank trades if those angles or flanks aren't open. Now, keep in mind, depending on your rank, those lanes and flanks might be open. If I'm playing Winston and I take the left high ground and in 6v6 there's nobody there, I'm not going to go out of my way to trade the enemy tank. I'm going to go directly to backline. But the odds of there being somebody on that lane in 6v6 is a lot more common. So just keep that in mind. Tank trades are not the end goal in 6v6 or 5v5, but it is the staging ground and is a lot more necessary in the more contested battlefields that 6v6 will provide. Now moving on to damage here. I think the key change here in terms of hero pick is that picking around the map is more important than picking around the enemy composition. Let me elaborate. In Overwatch 2, because there's so much more space with 5v5, it's generally pretty easy no matter what character you find to find a lane or an angle that complements your range. If you're playing on a sniper map, you could probably still find a lane as a Reaper to where you can avoid the sniper sightlines and pressure the enemy tank. But in 6v6, pretty much every lane is going to be contested. What this means is there's not going to be that open lane that will allow you to flex and fill and adapt your playstyle. So you're going to find yourself having to play DPS characters that fit the map because there's not really going to be any free space. Free space is what allows the flexibility of you to adapt your playstyle. And in 6v6, that free space is less available. If you're a Torb one trick or a Reaper one trick or a Widow one trick, in 6v6 there's going to be fewer lanes that are going to allow you to make things work. For example, in 5v5, you can run Widow and Lijiang Tower Control Center even if it's not optimal because it's less likely that there's going to be a body on coast side on Mega. That lane will probably be open most of the time and it will be a little bit difficult for them to contest. If they do contest you, well, that's probably the solo tank opening a lane on main. In 6v6, there's just another warm body. You're going to start to feel stuffed a lot more in that situation. And the same goes alternatively. Try to run a character like Junkrat in a wide open map. Those shorter sightlines that you may have used in 5v5 to spam a tank are probably now going to be contested by another tank. In general, it's important to counterpick the map and not necessarily the composition. Does the map have flanks? Does the map have long sightlines, short sightlines? Does the map have high ground? And so on. And finally, this is more of a catch here. Don't fall into the trap of only shooting tank just because it's 6v6. Obviously, like the tank tip, there will be more tank trading and more tank shooting in 6v6 because more of those lanes are contested by tanks now. But again, the end goal is to shoot DPS and support to take angles and space if available. And if you're playing at a rank or even playing at a high rank and there's just nobody on that particular lane that you want, don't hesitate. Take that lane. Angles and flanks are just as important in 6v6. They're just more well defended and contested in 6v6. All right, we'll move on to supports here. Generally, there's going to be a little bit less space for proactivity. I think support playstyle compared to tank and DPS is generally less interesting in the 6v6 format. There's more heal responsibility because there is another tank pool on the field. Just don't get too lazy. Again, this is more of a disclaimer. You are going to be healing more. There's going to be a little bit less space for you to take angles because in general, the supports have worse matchups versus tanks than DPS versus tanks, even with the lowered health pools. However, don't get lazy in terms of if you do see an open lane as an Ana or Zen or a open flank as a Lucio, or you see opportunities for proactivity, make sure that you're taking those options. Just keep in mind that they're more likely to be contested. And as I said, because you are a support and not a Hanzo or a Junkrat or a Reaper, it is going to be a little bit harder to clear those tanks out, especially in close range. When in doubt, assist your tanks in the tank trade, win that tank trade with your cooldowns and your damage and your healing, and then when your tanks win those cooldowns, fill those lanes, fill those angles with your body so that you're able to continue to snowball that advantage. I also think heal composition matters a lot more in 6v6. In 5v5, compositions like Zen Lucio, Mercy Lucio were always pretty historically bad in 6v6, but in 5v5, they were a lot more viable with a lot more tank combos because the amount of healing was distributed much better across the hero pool, especially considering the fact that many tanks didn't need all that much healing. Zen Lucio could function with Junker Queen, with Roadhog, with Sigma, with Wrecking Ball, and so on. But in 6v6, even with the current heal passive that we have now, you're going to find that higher heal compositions are going to be demanded more because there's just more health pools to heal, even with the reduced health of those tanks. The difference between flex support and main support isn't really relevant to what we're talking about, but what I am going to talk about is having a main healer or an off healer, which in other words, a healer that puts out a lot of sustain and a healer that puts out a lot of utility. Characters like Ana, Moira, Baptiste, and to a lesser extent, sometimes Mercy, I would be more closer to main healers because of the amount of healing output they do, whereas off healers would be more of the Zenyatta, Lucio, Brigitte, and so on. You're going to probably want, depending on your tank composition, at least least one main healer and one off healer. That's generally going to be the best way of doing things, where you have just enough healing to keep 2 tank pools alive and just enough utility to actually win the game. Now, that's not to say that you can't function without a main healer. There's a lot of compositions, Roadhog Sigma, Roadhog Zarya, Zarya Sigma, Wrecking Ball Junker Queen, that could probably function with very little healing and do just fine. In fact, thrive with very little healing. But if you do have a larger health pool tank, like a Reinhardt, like a D.Va, like a Winston, you're probably going to want some form of main healing to be able to keep their health pool up. Now, if that does happen, that you have a Reinhardt player and you only play Zen and you only play Lucio, you'll be fine. It's not the end of the world. It's just not going to be optimal. Finally here, many of you guys may have adjusted in the 5v5 format to be a little bit more creative and proactive with your support ult value. I know I've been coaching a lot of my Masters and Grandmasters and Yada players to use their trance almost selfishly, because it can be so difficult to find value in 5v5 because everyone's so spread out. So you take a flank, basically force yourself to solo trance yourself. Anyway, that's a lot of times how support ults have been used more often in 5v5, a little bit more creatively, a little bit more proactive. In 6v6, because those lanes are more contested and because there's just more warm bodies around you, you're going to find yourself evolving back to using more defensive support ult value. It's going to be a little bit easier to keep that second or just any of the tanks alive because there's more warm bodies around you. And it's going to be a lot easier to find more consistent value out of those ultimates without having necessarily to go a little bit crazy with it. Sound Barrier, Rally, Kitsune Rush, Juno ult, Transcendence, all of these ultimates I wouldn't say necessarily need to be or should be used defensively, but you don't have to get anything too creative with it as much. In the 6v6 format, there's just more value around the clump. If you still see opportunities to use things proactively, creatively, or take an angle, go for it. There's just going to be a little bit less space to do so and more value to be found with your team. As always, a lot of this is really subject to change depending on how these patch notes and balance things go. And obviously, this isn't a free ticket to winning every 66 game that you queue into. Regardless of whatever you do in this game mode, the most important thing is to have fun and to experiment and enjoy what Overwatch used to feel like. Whether you're a 66er or a 5v5 fan, you really need to enjoy what developers have put into this, and let's all appreciate the uniqueness and the different aspects of Overwatch that this game mode will highlight. Enjoy the test, and I'll see you in the next video.